This AgVision program is made possible through the generous support of Syngenta Seeds NK brand. The results you need, the freedom to choose. And by Farms.com. Ag news, market prices, ag careers, and farm real estate. You'll find it all at Farms.com.
I conducted managed a large project for the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and we addressed a series of questions and issues around the farm income situation and farm income prospects. And one of those studies then was a study we commissioned on pulling together all of the information on consumer attitudes with regard to food and farming. And so the study you referred to is one of those 16 studies. And the other studies were on other issues related to farm income and farm income prospects.
So you created a series of statements or assumptions and then tested them against the 16 studies, I guess. So let's walk through several of these if we can. The first one, you created a hypothesis that goes this way. Food safety is important to Canadian consumers. They're willing to pay more for safer food. The implementation of more or enhanced food safety programs such as traceability would increase the demand for food produced in Canada, which would result in increased farm income. A lot of assumptions there. So let's just take it a step at a time. Does the evidence that you looked at suggest that consumers would pay for enhanced safety programs?
No. First of all, as you know, there are many segments to consumers, or many consumer segments. So in these studies that we looked at, that we had access to, were for all consumers. So generally, across all consumer segments, they aren't willing to pay more for food quality. And I guess part of the reason is because Canada already produces a lot of high quality food. And so that is actually now, for a supplier of food, whether it's a processor or a farmer, that's a necessary condition to be successful supplying to the retail trade. And so in that environment, quality is a basic requirement, and hence there isn't a price premium attached to it. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't quality food products on the marketplace that are positioned that way and uniquely different from commodity type products that producers and food processors and retailers are getting premiums for. So when we talk about food safety and quality, there's a lot of factors that are rolled in together. And so one really has to strip them apart to kind of have a very conclusive or have a conclusion with regard to food safety or quality.
So are you suggesting possibly that these initiatives toward traceability will simply become the cost of doing business?
That's correct. In fact, if you look at traceability, you can ask the broader question, why do we have traceability? And it really is driven by it being a retailer and food processor requirement. Clearly the farm sector is on side, but traceability is really a requirement driven by retailers and food processors to minimize their risks and to minimize costs of product recall. So that's just kind of a cost of doing business within Canada today.
You covered, I believe, in one study, you covered created seven different hypotheses, and we'll get to a few of them here. And one of them I find interesting is the whole area that agriculture is important to Canadians and that they are willing to see farm incomes subsidized. Explain what you found there.
Sure. This is based on a couple of studies that we looked at. And so what this is saying is that for the average consumer, the farm sector and farmers are important to Canadians, and it's important that we have a vital and vibrant farm sector. And so what's also said within those studies is that if farmers cannot get enough out of the marketplace, they're willing to see tax dollars go to support farmers, which is actually a very encouraging thing. And it's somewhat related to the trend or event we see nowadays, which is there are certain segments of consumers who are willing to pay farmers for local produce because they want to do two things, this consumer segment. One is minimize food miles, and secondly, kind of support economic activity in the rural area outside the large cities.
So on that vein, did you find evidence, because there's been a lot of talk in agriculture in the last year or two, couple of years, about local food systems. Is there evidence that consumers will pay for that?
Yes, there is evidence that consumers will pay for that. In fact, there's one very interesting initiative which is at the University of Toronto called the Local Food Flavor, where there's 3 or 4 restaurants who are specifically purchasing local foods, positioning their restaurants, food service outlets as having only local foods, and prices reflecting that. And then there are producers in Ontario who are supplying their product into these channels and doing fairly well. So there are these market segments, some people call them niches, but let's call them market segments, where consumers are willing to pay for local foods and producers are meeting the requirements of the food service distributor to be the supplier of the local foods.
Now, the results that you found for environmental concern, I found interesting. In your hypothesis was simply that concern for the environment by consumers is growing and they would be willing to pay more for food produced in an environmentally sustainable fashion. So what did you find with that hypothesis?
Well, with that hypothesis, the evidence that we had in front of us, we couldn't accept the hypothesis that consumers would be willing to pay more. Clearly, environmental sustainability is an important issue for all Canadians, but as you know, then what is someone's willingness to pay for environmental sustainability? And that didn't come through on the research. And it goes a little bit like, for example, in prior studies that people would be asked the question, are you willing to pay more for organic foods? And they would have a series of hypothetical questions of 10% more, 20% more, 30% more. And the evidence that comes back is what people are willing to, what people say they're willing to do is much different what they actually do. So we know there's a very core segment of individuals who want to consume natural and organic foods, but that's different than the segment that would come back from consumer research. So it's a bit like saying, as your introduction, for example, if you ask someone, do you want a Mercedes or a Chevrolet? Many individuals would say, I'd like to have a Mercedes, which is irrespective of their ability to pay for that Mercedes. So some of that kind of information or those subtleties are also in many of these consumer research questionnaires and surveys that one has to sort out and discern as you're interpreting the results.
I wonder if one of the most challenging parts of what you've been doing would be to sort out the conflicting messages from all of these surveys. I mean, as I went through it, I read that, one study found that Canadians are confident in Canada's food system. Another shows that 50% have concerns about food safety. And then a third one shows that half had boycotted a food product that they felt was unsafe. So how do you pull that into a meaningful result?
Well, that's what we tried to do with this study, to try to pull that together, and that's why we set up this study to have a series of hypotheses which we would then test with all of the available market research studies that are out there. And so part of the issue you addressed is the issue of how are the questions framed. What are the actual questions that are being asked? For example, the boycotting, if I recall that question, that refers also to a certain segment saying that I will not consume food products from a certain country. So that's a form of boycott. Whether that's an action they take on every day is a secondary question. One of the very interesting things that came through that study and through other studies is the strong preference for consumers buying Canadian food. And so if you ask consumers in many countries, do you prefer foods from your own home country or imported foods, the average consumer would always rank consuming their locally or their domestically produced foods higher than imported because there's a greater trust and reliance factor on home supplies. That would appear, you'd find those results in Japan, for example, in Canada, the United States, you'd find them in most European countries. And so that's one item that comes through in all of these studies is a strong preference for local or domestic foods, not necessarily local, but domestic foods over imported foods. So that's one thing that comes through all these studies. But to interpret these studies, you really have to kind of look at the question, look at the response rate, and then in some of the studies they do a very good job of showing is there a statistical difference between responses to certain questions.
Well,